You know, for a couple of months I've been talking about typesetting and the fonts that you were likely to encounter in the 1980s and 1990s if you were on a computer. Sound like fun? Believe it or not, it is. Ready for another installment? I know you are. Welcome back. I am Stuart and I am your middle-aged hack, just a child of the 80s trying to make his way through the 20s, and I'm so glad you decided to take the journey with me. You know, I've done videos about Times Roman and avant-garde or century Gothic, Palatino or Book Antiqua. You know, the names are different depending on which system you use, and the typefaces are similar. This time, I'm talking about Bookman, and it's a font with really a lot of lost opportunities. It was a font that was incredibly popular, and yet somehow it's one that we don't tend to use anymore. Bookman actually has kind of an interesting history because it's a lot older than most of the other fonts that were included in either the early Macintosh or Microsoft Windows version 3.1. The original versions of Bookman date back to about the 1860s. When it was known as Old Style Antique. The font itself didn't have an italic or a bold italic. It was just the base version, and that made it not as useful as other fonts. You know, it kind of sat there and it wasn't incredibly popular for about 60 years for that reason. I made a video a while back about the American Type Founders, which was one of the most influential type companies of the early to mid 20th century. ATF took Bookman, which, like I said, was known as Old Style Antique. They renamed it, and I'm not quite sure why, other than Old Style Antique is kind of a generic name. And they added a bold, an italic, and a bold italic to it so that it became kind of a full-fledged font. For a font of its day, Bookman is really quite modern, despite the fact that it was known even then as Bookman Old Style. If you look at the lowercase letters, they're very tall and the openings are rather large. This is known as the X height, and it describes really how legible a font is going to be at small sizes. Overall, Bookman is very easy to read at small sizes, and that made it kind of very popular for fonts that needed to be used in books and stuff like that, which may account for the name Bookman. I'm not sure. Honestly, I wasn't able to find the exact provenance of that name. Bookman was around and people used it. It kind of fell out of favor in the 1940s and 50s as we started to see more internationally styled fonts like Futura and Helvetica that really had less ornamentation than Bookman. It came back, however, in the early 1970s. Bookman was redesigned by the International Typeface Corporation, another company that I did a video on, and you can see a little bit of a link to it. ITC was famous for taking older fonts and reworking them to work in more modern settings. And it was Ed Bengate, who I've mentioned before and is a personal hero of mine, a great typographer in his day, who designed a new version of Bookman called ITC Bookman that not only had all of the weights that it had before, also had kind of this medium weight, which had a little bit more variation between the thick and the thin parts. And more importantly, Bookman now had a full set of different curly cues, alternate characters. We call those collectively swashes. And that made Bookman very appealing to the typesetters of the 1970s. If you look, in fact, at all of these examples from the 1970s and early 1980s, you can see that Bookman was literally everywhere. And it's that way because it was so flexible, because of all of these extra little bits made it possible for your particular font application to look different from everybody else's. This is something that Ed Bengate did with other fonts that he designed, but he did it, I think, the most successfully with Bookman. The marketplace seemed to agree, and that's why you saw it a lot. When Adobe was first creating its PostScript language, which was the first universal language for printers, they wanted to include fonts that were popular. And they reached out to the people at ITC. ITC supplied them with avant-garde Gothic and Century Schoolbook, and it also supplied them with Bookman. There was a feeling that you wanted to include fonts that people really wanted and people wanted to use, but unfortunately, there was a limitation. We saw this with avant-garde, and we see it even more with Bookman. You see the character set, the list of all available letters and numbers for PostScript really didn't have room for any swash or alternate characters. It was really just, your ABCs and your 1, 2, 3s and your punctuation marks, and really not much else. So the versions of avant-garde and Bookman that shipped with the original PostScript system didn't have the most interesting bits. This kind of limited Bookman's use, and a lot of people in the time would ask me, okay, well, why should I use Bookman as opposed to Times Roman or Avant-Garde or Century Schoolbook? And the only thing that I could tell you at that time was that Bookman was bolder than any of those fonts, so you could use it for big signage, and also that Bookman was wider than a font like Times New Roman. So if you were doing a report for school and you wanted it to look longer than it was, you would use Bookman. That's the situation that continued on through the 80s, 90s, and even into the 21st century. In the late 1980s and going into the 1990s, Microsoft started providing fonts with its operating systems to kind of battle what Apple and Adobe had been doing, and the mandate was you had to have a one-for-one analog between the Microsoft fonts, which were called TrueType fonts, and the Adobe fonts, which were called PostScript fonts. And I've shown this before. And so what you saw was Bookman Old Style, which was licensed from Monotype, and there was another version from a company called Bitstream, extremely similar. Bookman Old Style was not quite as expansive. It had a lower X height than regular Bookman, but it did space out exactly the same way as the version of Bookman that was on Macintoshes, and that was the most important thing. I would say that by and large, Bookman was forgotten for most of that time. It was just something that, okay, well, if you only had 10 fonts on your computer, you might use it occasionally, but it was not something that you went out looking for. And the lack of attention to Bookman actually created problems for some companies that were still using it. The perfect example is the Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf Company, which didn't redesign their logo until the mid-2010s, and they were using a version of Bookman with swashes that didn't exist in digital type. So they had to kind of redraw it, and it looked a little bit lumpy in signage. Never quite looked perfectly right, but until you had another font that was going to work for it, or somebody spent a lot of time on it, there was nothing that could be done. In the meantime, technology marched on. There was a new standard for printing fonts called OpenType, which allowed for 1,024 different characters to be used in each style of a font, in addition to a bunch of other things that were really cool about it. There was the Unicode standard, which was for computer display fonts and allowed for, I think, also 1,024 characters in the same font. So you had all this room now. What was even better about OpenType is it had the technology to suggest alternate letters. So if you had, for example, one capital letter, you could look at it and you could choose alternate versions very easily if the software supported it. This finally opened up the doors for new versions of Avant-Garde and Bookman that really captured the spirit of what was being done in the 1970s. Mark Simonson, who is a typographer who's still working today and has done some amazing, amazing work, came out with a font in 2011 called Bookmania. There had been a swash version of Bookman called Bookman JF, but it was really inflexible, it didn't have the automatic alternates, and it was really just kind of the swash characters. Bookmania gives you every alternate you could possibly imagine for every weight of Bookman. It includes both the slanted or oblique versions of the italic and the true italic versions. I might do a video at some point explaining what the difference is between an oblique and an italic, but that's not the subject here. So when you really look at Bookmania, it brings back that everything that Bookman was supposed to be in the first place. It gives us a font that's really, really useful and that you can use for duplicating old logos and old designs. Even the coffee bean and tea leaf, though ironically they moved away from that style just a few years later. The last thing that I want to say about Bookman and Bookmania is that there's a lot of interest in it today. If you look at the Identify This Font subreddit, for example, Bookmania is one of the fonts that is requested to be identified more than any other. The others are very common ones like Helvetica and Futura, but Bookmania is something that you just see somebody asking about every single day because I think it's a cool font. It's a very expressive font. It's a font that lets you personalize who you are, kind of get your typographic freak on. That explains why it was so popular in the 1970s. And I guess it kind of explains why it's popular now. With so many choices of type, something really needs to stand out in order to really make a difference. You can get Bookmania through Adobe Fonts if you subscribe to that, and I think you can buy it separately. I don't know because I do subscribe to Adobe Fonts. It's worth checking out if you are interested in a font that really gives you a lot of flexibility. Anyway, that's it for the Middle-Aged Hack for today. Do me a favor, like, subscribe, share, leave a comment, because I am trying to monetize this channel and every little bit helps. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you next time on the Middle-Aged Hack channel.